we want to consider the microeconomic aspects of international trade. If you end up taking macro, you're going to hopefully see some international trade in there as well. This is the story of international trade, thinking about an individual market at a time. So we could think about the market for computer chips, the market for cars, the market for oil, things that are bought and sold all around the globe. The main idea is that we've got production and consumption do not have to happen in the same country. So we can think about these things that are traded globally. We can think about having the world or the global market for these goods and services. We can have a downward sloping world demand and an upward sloping world supply. We can think about that downward sloping world demand as really being the aggregation of all the individual countries' demand for those goods and services. That's the world demand for automobiles. That represents everybody's demand for automobiles in Canada, in the US, in Argentina, everywhere that people want to buy cars. This represents, for different prices, how many cars they want to buy. The supply, the world supply, corresponds to the same idea. That's an aggregation of what all sellers all over the globe would like to do at different prices. So that's going to represent US automakers, automobiles that are produced in Canada, automobiles that are produced in Argentina, all of production all over the globe. This is for different prices, how many units all of those producers would like to produce. We can think about if we've got a world market and global trade, then it's going to produce a world price. That PW represents the price that dominates world competition for those goods and services. And we also have another QW, that's the quantity of world production, right? That again corresponds to an equilibrium concept where the world price is going to be an equilibrium where the quantity demanded in the world is equal to the quantity supplied in the world. That's what goes on in the world, but in each individual country, the story might be a little bit different. We're going to think about the world market being the aggregation of everybody, and then I'm going to think about one particular domestic market. So given our context, I'm going to think about the domestic market as being the US market. But really this same story, this same logic holds for all countries. But I'm going to focus on an individual country, the US domestic market for goods and services. Notice we've got a difference between these two stories. We've got the world demand and supply in equilibrium at PW, but notice that for this first good up here, we've got that the world price is below where domestic demand and domestic supply intersect. Whereas down here, we've got that the world price is above the point where domestic demand intersects with domestic supply. When we talk about the domestic market, let's make sure we're clear on what the four things are. Domestic demand, DD, represents what everybody here in this country would like to buy for different prices. And domestic supply represents only what American companies produce for this good. We can think about domestic supply, domestic demand. If those two intersected, we'd end up with domestic prices, right? If we look at the intersection point between domestic demand and domestic supply, the domestic prices would represent the prices that would dominate if we closed our borders and did not trade with anyone. But if we're going to engage in globalization and world trade, world prices are lower than what domestic markets would otherwise produce without trade. We can think about low prices, what impact they have. At these low world prices, domestic quantity demanded is going to go up. At these low prices, gosh, our domestic producers not going to be happy about that. Some of them not going to be able to stay in business. It's not going to be rational for them because their costs are too high, and some of them are going to go out of business. We're going to see when we have global competition and we have lower world prices, the domestic quantity demanded is going to be higher, and the domestic quantity supplied is going to be lower. Some of our domestic companies not going to be able to compete on a world stage. this difference between the domestic quantity demand and the domestic quantity supplied, let's think about that, right? We've got this is the amount of production that occurs in the U.S., and some of that U.S. production is bought by U.S. customers. But U.S. customers want to buy a whole lot more than that. Where can U.S. customers buy additional goods if they can't buy it from here in the U.S.? They buy it from someone else in the world. So that sounds like us here in the U.S. buying goods from overseas. From the U.S. perspective, that sounds like we are importing goods and services. More generally, we can say that countries want to import a good when the price that their domestic markets would produce without trade is higher than what would be produced from the world price when we have global competition. The opposite story. If we have global competition resulting in a price equal to this world price, but that world price is higher than what our domestic prices would otherwise produce, that is, if we looked at what people here want to buy from our producers here, if that is a lower price than we otherwise would have, competing on the global market, it's going to have two impacts, right? At these high prices, gosh, who hates high prices? Consumers hate high prices. So the quantity demanded domestically is going to fall in this case. Whereas for producers, at these high prices, gosh, our producers suddenly, they try to ramp up production. Higher prices, producers try to ramp up production. High prices, quantity supplied domestically is going to increase. So again, if we have to compete on the world market and prices are higher than what our domestic markets would produce, our consumers aren't going to buy as much. But our producers, gosh, they're going to try to ramp up production. All of that production that happens at home, some of it is bought from our domestic consumers. But where does that excess production go? It goes back into the world market and someone in a foreign country buys it. From our domestic U.S. perspective, this sounds like we're exporting goods and services. Goods are produced here, but not enough people here want to buy them, and so those extra goods get sent overseas in the form of exports. We can do a real quick story about what happens with government intervention. We can do our case, what would our story look like, our welfare outcomes of producer and consumer surplus without trade. Point of reference. We've got this story about, what do we have going on here? We've got domestic prices are higher than world prices. Domestic prices higher than world prices. Domestic prices higher than world. It sounds like this is a story about importing. When our world global price is lower than what our domestic markets would otherwise produce, our domestic producers are not happy about this. They cut back their production. We can think about producer surplus being defined for those goods that producers sell and the price they receive. If they've got to compete in global markets, they're going to receive that world price. This domestic supply represents their cost of production, their producer surplus. Gosh, it looks like our domestic producers are not happy about this whatsoever. However, the other side of that story, what do our domestic consumers think about getting these low prices because of global competition? Well, again, remember, consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve. But I don't want to stop here. How many units do consumers get to buy? They get to buy all these units. A bunch of them were bought from overseas. But they get to buy all those units for very, very, very low prices. That huge triangle right there represents consumer surplus. So if we think about this, there's this area in polka dots that I'm trying to do right here. That used to be part of producer surplus when we didn't have international trade. Now it's consumer surplus. Again, that's simply a redistribution. I don't mind that so much. But then we also have this little area right here. This little area right here, what did it used to be? It used to be nothing. That used to be economic activity, economic value that did not happen. But now, because of trade, this happens. I want to think of it as a deadweight loss, but on the flip side, this is not a loss. This is a gain. Specifically, this is a measure of the economic gains from trade. Trade made this country better off. This area of redistribution, yes, producers are worse off, but in part, their loss was transferred to consumers. But in addition to that, consumers gained this additional area in green. You can think about what are some goods that we import because they're really cheap. What do our domestic producers think about us importing from other countries? They don't like it, right? But do you like paying low prices from lower priced imports? Sure you do. And in general, the gains that consumers get more than offset the losses from producers. That's the story about importing. We can also tell the story about exporting. Again, our basic point of reference here. We're going to keep that around. This is a story when we export. When does a country want to export? When the world price is higher than the prices of what would happen domestically. Right? So you can think about when world prices are higher and our producers, our sellers start operating on a global scale and they get these high prices, consumers, not a fan. That consumer surplus, we've got our domestic consumers are going to cut back how much they buy. And they have to pay higher prices, so unambiguously, consumers are worse off. When we have to export and compete with the rest of the world, and that bids up the price than we otherwise would have if we close down our markets, that makes consumers worse off. But when our producers are able to go overseas and export goods for higher prices than what our domestic markets would produce, gosh, producer surplus, off the charts. We have this huge increase in producer surplus. And it's the same story, but told in the opposite direction. This area in polka dots that I'm doing, that used to be consumer surplus. Now it goes to consumers. It used to be consumer surplus, now it goes to producers. Right? That polka dotted area is just a transfer. Consumers lose, but it's at the gain of producers. So that's kind of a wash. But what's awesome about this is this area in green right here. Again, this, because we've got access to foreign markets and more is being sold at higher prices, all of that, gains from trade. Those are gains that more than offset the losses that happen to consumers because they had to pay higher prices. So what we have is, if a country is going to export, there are gains from trade. If a country is going to import, there are gains from trade. It sounds like, regardless of whether you're an exporter or an importer, your country is going to gain. What's true is, those gains aren't equally shared. If a country is going to import, yes, overall they gain, but the distribution of those gains is not equal. Consumers gain through low prices, producers lost their job, they're worse off. If a country is going to export, we all gain, but not equally. Consumers end up worse off because they have to pay higher prices, and producers, they're better off because they have access to foreign markets